Thank you for having me here to present this research. This is research that's collaborated with Angel O'Mahony, who's now at the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica. And this is something that we've been working on for a few years, looking at the interaction between migrants, their financial remittances to their home countries, and home country elections around the world. We have a forthcoming article on this topic. It's coming out in the British Journal of Political Science. We have another one under review. And we're currently working on a book manuscript about this that we hope to complete by sometime next summer. So this is actually, we have a lot of results already and a lot of ideas, but we're still working on it. And this is a particularly good time for us to present, get feedback, get comments, get suggestions, tell us what you think is most interesting, what you think is unconvincing. So I look forward to getting any feedback that you might have. Now, before getting into the details of this project in particular, I want to step back for a moment and think about some of the sort of changing perceptions that we have of migrants across history, and in particular, changing perception of emigrants, so the perceptions in their home country. And if you think back 50 or 100 years, I don't think we have anybody who specializes in migration here, but what you'll find is that in general, in migrants' home countries where they left, they were often seen as being traitors. Because they were leaving, going somewhere else, and contributing to the success of some other country. That seems to have changed now a lot in many places. So Professor Jorge Durand calls this change in perception of emigrants as going from these emigrants as being traitors to being heroes. Now, Professor Durand might have been particularly influenced by the fact that Vicente Fox, former president of Mexico, frequently referred to Mexican immigrants as heroes. And lauded their contributions to building a stronger and more developed and wealthier Mexico. But this isn't simply a story about Mexico. If you look around the world, you see this sort of emphasis on immigrants as heroes as become ever more prominent. So in the Philippines, overseas Filipino workers are celebrated on National Heroes Day, which is in late August. In Indonesia, there's even a phrase for them, referring to overseas Indonesian workers as foreign exchange reserve heroes, which I'm told by one of my PhD students actually sounds better in Bahasa Indonesian than it does in English. Why is it that migrants, have gone from being traitors to being seen as heroes in their home countries? Well, there's possibly lots of explanations for this, but one of the things that sort of stands out to anybody who studies migration is that the sheer number and the economic importance of migrants for their home countries. There are more than 200 million migrants living around the world now. And in 2011, they sent almost $400 billion, in fact, more than $400 billion if you count unofficial channels, but almost $400 billion back to their home countries in the developing world. So a lot of money. This is the second largest source of foreign capital to developing countries. And in fact, for the poorest countries in the world, particularly some of the African countries, it is by far the largest source of foreign exchange. Governments are increasingly trying to promote remittances from their migrants and are in fact being prodded to do so by the World Bank. This is a key part of World Bank's current practices for promoting economic development. And they've seen, particularly in the last 10 years or so, an emphasis on seeing remittances as an important and stable source of external development finance. But what you see in sort of the talk from the World Bank and from those who promote it as sort of a source for development is an emphasis on the economic and social welfare contributions of remittances, and it's an ignorance, sort of a big gap in thinking about the political side of financial remittance, of migrants sending money home. So that's where this project that I'm working on with Angel O'Mahony is trying to contribute. We're trying to look at the political economy of remittances, and specifically, we want to look at the relationship between remittances, migrants' various motivations for sending those remittances, and home country elections. It's important to realize, and we think that this is a big problem in the sort of existing public policy literature on remittance flows, that migrants aren't merely sort of silent partners in promoting development and social welfare in their home countries. They have political interests as well. Ricardo Monreal, former governor of the state of Zacatecas, often noted that migrants' economic influence is huge, and as a consequence, their political influence in his home state of Zacatecas was particularly large as well. So let me explain the specific project we're working on here. And that is, we're trying to understand the political economy, the political side of remittance flows, and in particular how that relates to political interests that migrants may have, and in particular their interests in home country elections. So overall, this is a large project. I'm not going to be able to present all of it to you, but the project has three sort of related goals. First, we want to convince people that political remittance cycles exist. And what do I mean by political remittance cycle? Migrants send more money home in the lead up to elections in their home country. So not the US election here, no, elections in their home country, okay? So I'm going to try to convince you of that using a range of data sets and statistical analyses in a bit. But these political remittance cycles don't happen for every election, or at least not for every election to the same extent or to the same magnitude. We think that given what we understand about the various interests that migrants have and the wide range of meanings that elections can have, that we should expect bigger and smaller political remittance cycles depending on a lot of things. In particular, we think that political remittance cycles should be more likely when migrants are doing well economically, so when the economic conditions in migrants' host countries is quite good. And also we think that political remittance cycles should be greater dependent upon the political conditions in their home country. So if the elections are free and fair, if they're highly competitive, if they're exciting, if they matter to migrants, we should see larger political remittance cycles. And finally, we want to show you that these political remittance cycles matter. And in particular, we want to suggest that migrants are more likely to support opposition parties and opposition candidates than people back home, and this is for a range of reasons. This isn't universally true, but we think it's true in general. And when they send more money home, when the political remittance cycles are greater, in fact, we see greater opposition party and opposition candidate success in elections. And thus, these political remittance cycles contribute to political change in developing democracies. Okay? That makes sense? So this is actually a lot to try and cover in not enough time, but I'm going to do my best, and hopefully any of the pieces that get dropped I'll be able to pick up again in Q&A or something like that. So why talk about this now? Why, human migration is not exactly a new thing. We've been doing it for as long as there's, the course of history. In fact, before history, in prehistory, as long as there have been humans, humans have been going around the world looking for better opportunities, right? What's different about now in the current wave of migration is how easy it is for migrants to maintain their ties back home. Okay? You can think through the technological changes here, but obviously travel has become substantially cheaper and quicker. For migrants. The cost, even in my lifetime, has dropped considerably. Telephone communication, also, the cost of international telephone calls in my lifetime has dropped, to be 10% of what it was about the time when I was born. And of course, and crucial for the story we're going to be telling today, the ability of migrants to send money home safely, quickly, and with relatively little, I should say less than it used to be at least, overhead, has changed dramatically in the last sort of 20 to 30 years. Western Union, amongst others, have reinvented themselves targeting migrants and migrant workers, and that's the bulk, a large portion of their business for them, as well as, the many other, I remit, and you name them. In fact, at this point, through official channels, the estimate is that there were $370 billion sent to the developing world by migrants in 2011, and that's only the official channels. It's really hard to get a handle on sort of migrants just bringing the money home themselves and or going through unofficial channels. Most estimates are that there's another sort of additional 50%, perhaps even twice as much money going through unofficial channels. That's a data issue that I'll talk about a little bit more in the future. So why are migrants sending money home? Seems like a reasonable question. the bulk of the literature that studied remittance flows has focused on the economic concerns that migrants have. And the vast bulk of what migrants are sending money home for is to take care of their family. It's to put food on the table, put roofs on their heads, make sure that people can survive. You know, the migrants, the bulk of remittances go for everyday consumption for families and communities back home. Migrants' remittances also serve as insurance against adverse shocks. In particular, I mean, being a migrant worker in Vancouver, Canada, I can tell you any number of stories of my sister calling me up, catching up on how my daughter's doing, and then say, oh, by the way, my car broke. Any chance you can send some money? You know, she's a social worker in DC. She doesn't make that much money. Is there any chance that you can send a bit of extra money to fix my car, so I can get my car fixed and keep on doing what I'm doing? So, you know, these adverse shocks may, of course, be at the sort of individual and idiosyncratic level, but they could be, you know, natural disasters. So we see that when natural disasters strike, remittances go up dramatically, or more generally, when migrants' home countries' economies tank, remittances go up. These first two sort of economic purposes that remittances serve lead remittance flows to be countercyclical to migrants' home country economies. So in general, when things are going worse in the developing world, migrants send more money home to the extent that they're capable of doing so. There is one portion of remittances that receives a lot of focus that isn't necessarily countercyclical in the same way. And that is migrants also send money home for investment purposes to contribute to economic development, public goods provision in their home communities. And this isn't actually, at least to the extent we have evidence, a huge percentage of remittances. But it's an important one for policymakers. It's an important one. This is a lot of what governments are trying to promote. With things like the 3-for-1 program, Mexico, you know, this is a crucial aspect of these remittances. Now, and so what's interesting is that in the studies of remittance flows, of the studies of the flows themselves, these three things are pretty much all that people have looked at, okay? Despite the fact that if you look at sort of ethnographic evidence, case studies of migrants, migrant communities, diasporas, survey research suggests that migrants aren't just all about these economic concerns, right? They care about social things, they care about political things. They're politically active and involved. And so a big part of the contribution of this project, we hope, is to sort of bring to the study of remittance flows what's been brought to the study of pretty much every other international economic flow. You name it, FDI, trade, foreign aid. There are any number of studies that show the political influences on those flows. Those studies don't exist for remittance flows. And we think it's kind of shocking because migrants are people. People care about politics, and not just sort of political junkies like me, but you know, regular people care about politics too, right? So this is really a big thing of what's going on. Now, you might be thinking many migrants lead quite hard lives. Are they really sort of thinking about politics all that much? Well, to the extent that we have evidence from surveys of migrants, from ethnographic case studies and so forth, the answer is actually yes. They actually do really care about politics at the most general level. Now, most of them aren't actively engaged in politics every single day, but most of them are actually following news every day, news from their home country. And this by itself leads to further political, even though they're not in their home country, there is political socialization going on just by following news from the home country. This starts at quite an early age. This is my 4-month-old daughter at the time, living in Vancouver, following the Obama's acceptance speech, 2008. You know, now my daughter is now 4 years old. Doesn't know much about politics, but she knows that elections are exciting, that mommy and daddy have friends over and they stay up late watching election returns. And you might say, okay, you know, Ness is doomed to be politically socialized from an early age. She has 2 political scientists as parents. But the truth is, migrants as a whole actually are following what's going on back home. They are in touch with people back home. They do care about politics back home. And so, you know, this is, you know, 4-month-olds, this is actually actually typical, you know. Yeah, admittedly, she's not getting all that much about this. She's still struggling on who Obama actually is, but, you know, it's a start. Anyway, but of course, it's not just the relatively passive thing of following news. Migrants organize. They form interest groups. They lobby governments. They have particular interests that they wish to be heard. Migrants form and join political parties. They're active in this. And crucially for our purpose is migrants participate in elections. In many cases they can vote, although extraterritorial voting rights vary extremely from country to country. I'll tell you more about that in a bit. But even when they can't vote, they may be actively involved in campaigning, trying to persuade family and friends back home to vote a certain way. And of course, they may be financing political campaigns as well. You know, think about elections in the Dominican Republic, for example. Some people have argued they're as heavily contested in New York City as they are in the Dominican Republic. The evidence is that roughly half of the political funds for political parties in the Dominican Republic are from the U.S. rather than from the Dominican community in the U.S. All sorts of studies of Indian political parties, particularly the Hindu nationalist parties, find that their strongest support and the largest portion of their financing comes from overseas Indian communities. Presidential candidates in the Liberian presidential elections, they typically announce their candidacy, their official announcement of their candidacy in the US, because as part of fundraising tours. This is, you know, I mean, we can go back historically as well. We can talk about IRA funding. I mean, there's lots of, you know, examples of migrants being extremely involved politically and interested. And so this is sort of, we think this is missing in studies of remittance flows. And we find it kind of sad. You know, the case study work is there. The ethnographic work is there. If you read interdisciplinary migration studies, it's all there. But it's missing in the work that by, say, World Bank economists or, you know, in general, the studies of remittance flows. This leads me to sort of the core argument that I want to get at. Our central hypothesis for this project is that we expect elections in migrants' home countries should be associated with an increase in aggregate remittance flows. This seems fairly straightforward why this might be the case. It's because migrants may be interested in politics. And elections and election campaigns are the times when that interest increases. Now, we can think through an instrumental logic here. So political remittances might have the greatest leverage during election campaigns, right? This is when you want to use your money for politics to influence votes, to buy access to politicians, because this is when the politicians and the parties want more money. But we can also, and it's important to think about political finance, particularly individual level contributions, as having a non-instrumental logic as well. The evidence, for example, on individual donations to campaigns in the US is that a lot of it is not sort of attempts to influence election outcomes. I'm talking about individual level donations, not other stuff. It's because people are enthusiastic. They're ideologically motivated. They're engaged in politics. They want to feel part of the team. It's like that's why people buy Dodgers jerseys, or you name it, right? They want to feel like they belong. When I buy a Dodgers jersey, I'm not, you know, thinking that, oh, gee, this will help make the Dodgers win. It's because I want to be part of something, right? So there's a non-instrumental political logic here that may be going on as well. Both of these things, though, suggest to us that remittances should increase in the lead-up to elections, because that is when the political excitement is there. That's when the political remittances should have greater leverage. Okay, but not all elections are equal. And this gets to the second sort of key argument I want to get out. And that is, we think that political remittance cycles are conditional on political, economic, and in fact social factors. There are a lot of things that should be influencing political remittance cycles, and I can't discuss all of them today, but I want to highlight two. First of all, we think that political remittance cycles should be greater when the economic conditions in migrants' host countries are good. Political remittances, we think are important, that's why we're doing this project, but they're not the most important thing to most migrants. Migrants care about, you know, surviving. Migrants care about providing for their family and community. And so when times are tough, they're not going to be sending a lot of political remittances. They're going to be doing what people do when times are tough, trying to make ends meet, right? So when economic conditions are worse in migrants' host countries, we should expect weaker or non-existent political remittance cycles. On the other hand, when we do expect that political remittance cycles should be greater when elections are more interesting, more exciting, and more important. And in particular, when elections are actually meaningful, when they're highly competitive, as opposed to being foregone conclusions. We should expect greater, both on the instrumental logic, the political remittances might have more impact, but on the non-instrumental logic, close elections are just a lot more exciting, right? So we should expect political remittance cycles to be greater when elections in the home country are more free, fair, and in particular competitive. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. All right, fine. Whoa, that was fast. Gee, I can't talk quite that fast. I can work on it though. Okay, finally, third key point that we want to be testing and presenting on in this project is that we think that remittance increases prior to elections, i.e. political remittance cycles, are associated with greater opposition party or opposition politician success. Now, why is this the case? Well, the simple truth is that migrants are actually somewhat different than the people who remain in the home country. I mean, if we want to sort of take a Hirschman-style exit voice loyalty sort of framework, they have chosen or had foisted it upon them in some cases, exit. And this should suggest some sort of dissatisfaction with the status quo in their home country. And we can think about exceptions where incumbent politicians are somewhat successful at appealing to migrants and migrant communities, where we can think about politicians in general who are, despite the fact that they're incumbents, are successful at running against the status quo. I studied Japan. I could have all sorts of stories about that. But on average, in aggregate, we tend to think that migrants should be more likely to have some dissatisfaction with the status quo in their home countries. And as such, they should be more likely to support opposition parties and politicians. And so if they are sending more money home in elections, in the lead up to elections, we should expect opposition parties to do better in those elections. Now, testing this is not trivial by any means whatsoever. We've got some huge endogeneity issues, but I'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so overall goals of the empirical work in this project: establish the systematic existence of political remittance cycles, explore the conditions that influence their presence and magnitude, and demonstrate their political impact. Straightforward? Well, not actually straightforward, but at least hopefully interesting. Okay, so what's our strategy here? We're doing primarily quantitative work. And the reason for this is not that we think that the qualitative work here is unimportant or uninteresting. We just think that the qualitative ethnographic survey work that's been done already clearly shows what's important and what's missing from the quantitative analysis of remittance flows. We know that migrants have political interests. We know that they're transactional actors. The evidence, the qualitative evidence, the survey evidence is really convincing. That those ideas have not been taken to quantitative studies of remittance flows. And so that's really what we're trying to do here. For those of you who are more technically inclined, we're using what I would say are fairly standard statistical methods in political economy. Most of our models are sort of, OLS with panel corrected standard errors and/or country and time fixed effects. And this is when we're trying to establish the existence of or conditions influencing political remittance cycles. For establishing the impact of political remittance cycles, we used an instrumental variable approach, which I'll explain when we get to that, because it's really, you need to get that first step to understand the instrumentation strategy. We have a lot of different data sets, and I can't present results from all of them. I don't have enough time. Our central data set is, looks at annual national level remittance flows to 124 developing countries. Our analysis is for 1990 to 2010, although our data goes back, in some cases, back to 1980. I also am going to be presenting some subnational evidence for state-level remittance flows to Mexico. This is really important if we think that migrants are particularly tied to their to their community, to their state. And so to the extent that we see political remittance cycles at the state level or local level, this is reassuring in many ways to people who study migration and focus on remittances going to the local level. And so I'm going to present results from these two data sets. I also have a monthly cross-national data set for a much smaller set of countries, mostly Latin American countries and the Philippines. And this is really important for sort of establishing that these political remittance cycles actually happen before the election rather than after. One of the problems in trying to show work with annual data is that it's, campaigns aren't typically, they don't go exactly from January to December. It doesn't work that way. And we also have some monthly Philippines data that is really interesting because unlike almost all the other remittance data, it's broken down by source country, so where the money's coming from, and that allows us to tease out some stuff. But I won't have time probably to present those two things. So our data sources for the cross-national data is typically from the World Bank, World Development Indicators. Also, for, our national, subnational data is from a range of central banks. To sort of keep in the matching with the remittance flow data, most of our economic data is taken from the World Development Indicators as well. Our political data is taken from a range of cross-national political data sets. Most of our election data comes from Hyde and Marinov's National Election Data Archive. We also use Phil Kiefer and colleagues' database of political institutions, the Polity data set, others. We're also working, at this point, I unfortunately won't be presenting results from this yet, on an original data set on extraterritorial voting rights and when they were extended. It's actually somewhat shocking. IDEA has small data set on this, but we've got the first sort of time series cross-national data set that allows us to analyze the determinants of extension of extraterritorial voting rights, and we're working on some side papers on that as well as integrating that into our work on remittances. But that's down the line. Stay tuned next spring. Anyway, here's the sort of does this pass the eyeball test picture. And what we've simply done in this is from 1990-2005. This is just a crosstab, graphic presentation of a crosstab. You know, how much were the remittances when in a given country year there was an election versus how large were the remittance flows in a given year when there was no election. And see that for this period, it averaged something like 225 or 230 million in years there were elections, and only about 170 in years where there weren't elections. Now, you know, I like passing the eyeball test just as well as the rest of people, but of course there are problems with this. There are any number of, on average, for example, countries that have elections get higher remittances than countries that never have elections. So we can think of all sorts of things that throw off, sort of by various crosstabs, that could confound things. So this is why we have to do multivariate analyses, right? And so for the cross-national analyses, our dependent variables is natural log of remittances, again taken from the World Development Indicators. Our key independent variable is a contested election. I'll break this down to legislative and executive in a moment. And from the bat, for this talk, I'm just going to exclude all the a priori uncompetitive elections. And these are elections that are legally not competitive, i.e. the opposition was legally not allowed. There was only one party that could legally exist, or there was no choice of candidates on the ballot. So there's a surprising number of elections that occur, but that don't meet those criteria, and we just exclude them straight up. I can show you results at some point that really, they don't do anything. Those aren't treated as elections in quite the same way. So, yeah, and so typically our results, again, are sort of ordinarily squares with country and year fixed effects. We have lots of robustness stuff. I can show, I have all those models, robustness models, as supplementary slides if anyone really wants to get into that later on. Control variables, we've, over the years, done a whole host of control variables. Most of the models I'm presenting today work like this. So we have a lag-dependent variable. These are lag-dependent variable models. And then we control for the standard set of sort of economic and demographic considerations that you see in the existing cross-national remittance flow analyses. So, you know, how many migrants abroad from that country are there? You know, what's the GDP per capita, total GDP, and these GDP growth. These are all for the home country. And also, of course, we control for high-income country growth. That's a key determinant of remittance flows overall. When migrants, when things aren't going well economically in the developed world, migrants don't have as much money to send home. Talk about other alternative control variables or things that you think might matter, perhaps a bit later. This is what a sort of typical results table looks like. And I don't like, particularly for broader audiences, presenting sort of model after model after model in tables. And since I'm, have probably 15 or 20 different models I'm going to be presenting, or at least showing, I'm not going to show this. But typically, you're going to see that we have, lagged remittances explains the bulk of the variation in remittances. This is typical for lag-dependent variable models. And we're going to include a series of variables that I want to walk you through. And those are the key variables. Instead of doing these sorts of results tables, for the talk, I'm going to actually switch to a graphic presentation of the results. Again, Q&A, I have all the tables. So in Q&A, if you want to look at specific models, you want to discuss specific issues, I'm happy to do so then. So what's going on in, well, say, our initial results here? Here's what we find. On average, there's a statistically significant increase in remittances going to countries in the developing world in years in which there's a legislative election. Okay, so it's a logged dependent variable, but so for the average, so the median country, this increase is about $12 million. This is actually roughly 5% of remittance flows. So remittance flows go up by about 5%. Now, one of the problems with using this annual data is the fact that, say the election happens on January 4th, given our story, you should expect actually that the remittance increase should happen during the campaign and in the lead up to the election. So it should happen in the previous year. So one thing that we do is to sort of look at this and make sure that, to see if this is going on. So we do use the monthly data that I talked about briefly. But the other thing that we do for our annual data is we do a one-quarter adjustment. So when we do the one-quarter adjustment, we treat a country year as having an election if an election actually occurs between April and December of that year or January to March of the following year. So we expect the increase in remittance flows to occur in the previous year for elections that happened in the first couple months of the year. Anyway, when we do that control, going from about 4.5%, the increase now is roughly 6%. So our results improve, confidence intervals shrinks a bit. And we think that this adjustment is actually quite consistent with what we find when we have more disaggregated data from monthly or quarterly remittance flows. Now, sadly, while we find sort of consistent evidence at this level for political remittance cycles for legislative elections, we don't find it for executive elections. We estimate an effect of about 2%, $6 million for the average country in our sample, and not significant at all. Now, before we give up on this, I should mention that we actually think that there are political remittance cycles for executive elections. We just think that there are a lot of executive elections that aren't competitive. Okay? And I'll get to that when we talk more about the conditionality of these political remittance cycles. Okay? Time flies. Okay. Wanted to present some subnational evidence, because we do think that migrants have, and their remittances are targeted at local level concerns, for families, for communities. And so what we've done is the Central Bank in Mexico has provided state-level remittance flow data starting in 2003 on a quarterly basis. Okay? And so this gives us a great opportunity, combined with some aspects of the Mexican political system, to test whether there are subnational political remittance cycles. And so overall, our models are of a similar structure to the cross-national analyses. Our dependent variable is slightly different. We actually normalize it by the number of migrants per state living in the US. So this actually leads to a relatively easy interpretation of the results and the magnitude of what they mean. So our dependent variables remittance in thousands of constant pesos per migrant living in the US for that state. And we have to add, because we have quarterly data, we need to deal with seasonal effects, which are of course quite important in remittance flows. And so we have not just the 1-quarter lag, but the 4-quarter lag as well to deal with seasonality. Our data again is from the Mexican Central Bank. For migrants living in the US, we take data from CONAPO from the middle of this period. Yeah, so let me just show you the results. So what we've done is we've included dummy variables for the quarter of the presidential election, the quarter prior to the presidential election, and then the quarter of each gubernatorial election for that specific state, and the quarter prior to each election for the gubernatorial elections. And we find absolutely no increase in the quarter of the presidential election. This is the 2006 presidential election. And this is actually very good news for us because the election happened in early July, i.e. the very beginning of quarter 3. So we would really expect the increase to happen in quarter 2. We estimate roughly a 1,400 peso per migrant increase. Now you might think 1,400 pesos, that's not very much. It's not. When you realize that you're multiplying that by 10 to 12 million migrants, this is actually not small potatoes. There is one problem in sort of relying on these results for the presidential election, though, and that is we've only got one presidential election in our data set. We're 2003 to 2011. And as such, this is effectively a dummy variable for quarter 2 of 2006. So anything else that happened to potentially increase migrants' remittances back to Mexico in 2006 quarter 2 would fall into this. So we don't actually have strong identification here, to say the least. And if you sort of have a good memory for how economic conditions are doing, 2006 quarter 2 was actually a pretty good economic time. So we don't want to sort of rest too heavily on this for the presidential elections. However, for gubernatorial elections, we have a lot more confidence, even though the effect is smaller. So again, nothing on the quarter of the election itself, but we estimate an increase of about 650 pesos per migrant abroad in the prior quarter, in the lead up to a gubernatorial election. And these gubernatorial elections are spread out along a 6-year electoral calendar. Only about half a dozen of them occur at the same time as the presidential election. The other 25 or so are spread out. And so we have a greater confidence that this is actually something that's tied to gubernatorial elections and isn't just a particular effect of, quarter 2, 2006 or something like that. Does this make sense? We have a lot of robustness stuff in the actual models that I can show you later if you want to know more. I also have this broken down so people with a particular interest in Mexican politics, you can see which states we sort of see this effect and which states we don't. Okay, but these are sort of average treatment effects. These are sort of the average results for all these elections. And we don't think that the world isn't driven by the average here. There are interesting things going on and interesting variation in elections and in various conditions that should be influencing political remittance cycles. So again, this is the two key conditioning factors we want to think about are economic conditions in migrants' host countries and political factors in their home countries. Okay? And for the conditionality of political remittance cycles in Mexico, we gave this some thought, and we really think it's crucial to capture US economic conditions. 99% of Mexican migrants abroad live in the US. And state-level political competitiveness, which varies greatly in Mexico, for those of you who know. Some states are sort of one-party dominated, and the same party has won by 30 points forever. Other states is very closely fought. So we can use a range of economic variables for US economic conditions, either say US GDP growth, quarterly US GDP growth, or the US Latino employment rate. Both of those work just fine for our results. I'm going to show you the GDP growth ones. And the measure we use for state level political competitiveness and the expected competitiveness of the election is the margin between the top two parties in the previous House of Representatives election. So in fact, in about 10% of our sample, the top two parties were separated by 1 point or less. And in another 10% of our sample, they were separated by 25 points or more. So there's a huge range here. Okay? And so what we have in the statistical model here is a triple interaction between the gubernatorial election, US economic conditions, and the vote share margin. Okay? And triple interactions are also difficult to interpret directly from the table, so let me show you some pictures. This is what the effect of a gubernatorial election holding constant the difference between the top two parties. So when this is for highly competitive states, and varying US GDP growth. And what we find over here is that there's no change, no significant change in remittances when US GDP growth is low. But when there's an election, and the election is in a state that's highly competitive, politically competitive, we see an increase of remittances starting at about US GDP growth being 2, that this is statistically significant from 0, of anywhere from 300, 400 pesos per migrant. And if US GDP growth is quite high, upwards of 4%, we see almost 1,000 pesos per migrant being set above and beyond general expectations. Now, if we vary the other side, hold, whoa, gee, that thing sticks really easily. And those are all the supplementary tables. I can show you them really fast. Anyway, if we hold US GDP growth constant, we find again, when the election is expected to be close, when this is a competitive state politically, about 1,000 pesos per migrant abroad. And then as you get to about, say, 15% vote margin between the two parties, this effect is cut in half and barely statistically significant. And as the gap gets to be more than about 15 percentage points, there's no statistically significant political remittance cycle. Does this make sense? All right. Okay. Well, yeah, go ahead.
Now, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the connection between the financial remittance and political activity. Do you have an estimate of the percentage of funds that are remitted that are used for political purposes?
No, we don't. And this is a very difficult thing to do. And I'm going to get back to that. Can I get back to that in a little bit? Because oh, that's right, you have to leave. Okay, the short answer is that we can't sort of demonstrate what proportion of this remittance increase goes directly to political candidates or parties. That data just simply doesn't exist. We can we do think that not all of it is going to politicians and candidates. That we think some of it may be going to voters and trying to persuade voters. And so it's a difficult thing to try and get a handle on. This is part of where we think some of the specifics of where money might be going is better done through the case study and survey research that currently is going on. Not for the large sample of things we're doing here, but we can certainly know, for example, there are survey questions out there of Mexican migrants living in the U.S. What percentage of them send money home for political purposes, and it's actually surprisingly high. We're 20 to 30% perhaps. So those that actually say they send money home for political purposes is actually reasonably high. Okay, but we can't do it for our cross-national work is 124 countries. That sort of survey data simply doesn't exist, unfortunately. So. Conditionality of political remittance cycles in the annual data. We look at this for both the legislative elections and the executive elections, and I have to tell you, we have 600 and some odd different legislative elections across 124 countries. Trying to come up with a good, consistent measure of competitiveness is hard. I can talk, this is one of the things that I do is study legislative politics and political party systems. I can tell you this is really hard. I have ideas, I can talk about this at length, but I'm not going to show you anything from it because it's all really messy. That being said, for economic conditionality, what we do have a fairly straightforward measure of economic conditions that migrants are facing, and that's high-income country growth. This is, again, taken directly from the World Development Indicators. So we want to show you those results that we had for legislative elections and interacting the existence of an election with the economic conditions in the high-income countries. For executive elections, we, again, are going to condition on high-income country growth, interact the election with high-income country growth. And then for competitiveness, we do have a measure. And it's a crude measure, but we think it's actually a measure that captures things a lot. It captures things pretty well given the existing literature. And that is, we simply have a dummy variable that says, does the incumbent and or the incumbent's hand-picked successor run or not? If the incumbent and or their hand-picked successor runs, the existing literature points out that they win something like 90-ish% of the time. On the other hand, if the incumbent or hand-picked successor does not, this is in the developing world, this isn't true elsewhere. If they don't, the election is coin toss almost. It's seen as highly competitive. And so if we separate out those two, we have some sense of this group of elections, and the split is something like 60-40, or maybe 2/3, 1/3, 2/3 of the time there is an incumbent or a hand-picked successor running, 1/3 they're not. We have some sense of, in this pool, the elections are much less competitive. In this pool, the elections are more competitive. And so we, again, effectively have a triple interaction here for the executive elections, with the executive elections only. Now, the results that we get for the legislative elections are actually quite consistent with what we found for the Mexican data. And that is, when high-income country growth is low, we don't have a significant political remittance cycle. By the time the GDP growth is about 2%, it's statistically significant, and upwards of 4%, we see an effective almost 15% increase in remittances year over year if there's an election and there's high-income countries are doing well. Okay. For executive elections, this is what we find. When an incumbent or successor runs, nothing. This is actually like one of the most sort of perfect nothings I've ever presented. It's like, it's very cleanly nothing. So you shouldn't be proud of results that show nothing, but yet somehow. So as you can see, 0 right there. This line it's not quite 0, but it's really close. On the other hand, when no incumbent or successor runs, we in fact see the largest political remittance cycles of any of the results we've run. And so again, there's nothing when high-income country growth is low. But it starts being statistically significant around 2%. And we, in fact, see an increase of about 25% in remittances year over year when there are highly competitive executive elections in the developing world. OK. Does this make sense? Yeah. People are following. Good. OK. This is the part where it gets a little bit more complicated statistically. I'm going to not overdo this here, But let me say that one of the fact that we find this conditional effect of competitiveness on political remittance cycles makes it really hard to demonstrate the effect of political remittance cycles directly on election outcomes. Because, of course, political remittance cycles themselves are endogenous. So we expect greater political remittance cycles when the election is more competitive. So simply saying, oh, gee, incumbent wins or the incumbent loses more when there are political remittance cycles isn't good enough. We don't know if that's simply the selection effect, effectively a selection effect of migrants sending more money home when they already know that it's going to be competitive. And so basically this is, remittance flows are not exogenous to home country politics, and so we can't simply just use the same sort of statistical setup that we've done before. What we're going to do is the instrumental variable regression approach. And simplified version of what IV regression does, it allows us to isolate the effect of changes in remittance flows that we can attribute to plausibly exogenous factors. Okay? In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to say remittance flows depend in part on high-income country growth. And those influence remittance flows. And high-income country growth is exogenous to these political conditions in the developing world. And so what we're going to do is do a IV regression, it's a two-stage regression, in which the first stage we use economic conditions in the high-income countries to predict changes in remittances. And then relying on that variation in remittances that we can attribute just to high-income country growth, we'll use that variation in the second stage to see what effect it has on election outcomes. Okay? So for those of you who aren't familiar with IV regression, that's hopefully somewhat clear. For those of you who are familiar, I look forward to you hammering me on the IV regression strategy. Anyway, so again, economic conditions in high-income countries, that's our instrument, and we're going to for change in remittances. And we're then going to say to what extent do remittances influence election outcomes. Again, things are a little complicated in determining who wins or loses legislative elections. So I'm going to focus on executive elections here. The average change in remittances in our data set is about 0.1, and this is in terms of a log. So remittances are going up over time, so this is what we'd expect. And we see that on average, when it's about 0.1, the incumbent loses 25% of the time, which is or the incumbent or the successor or the incumbent's party loses 25% of the time. However, if the increase in remittances is, say, 0.25 more, 25% more, up here about 35, which is the average for a competitive executive election, the incumbent loses almost 60% of the time. It's a huge effect. And statistically significant at standard levels, blah, blah, blah. Interestingly enough, the difference between remittances decreasing and average remittances is also significant. So when things are going really badly, I think 2008, 2009 for migrants, incumbents in the developing world were actually doing better because remittances dropped down. Yeah, so those are the sort of initial results that we have for the impact of these political remittance cycles on political outcomes in the developing world. Anyway, I'm running a bit over time, but not too badly. Key results here. So again, remittances increase in the lead up to home country elections. These political remittance cycles are conditional on economic and political factors and several other factors that I haven't had time to present. And these political remittance cycles appear to increase the probability of opposition success, even when we try to account for the endogeneity of these political remittance cycles. In progress work that I can talk about more, we are doing a lot of work right now that's in progress on migrants' political engagement. So we think there should be some variance. Migrants are more politically engaged in some places rather than others. And so we're trying to think about the factors that influence that, as well as trying to get direct measures of migrant political interest in particular elections. In particular, we think we have ways of doing that for the Mexico subnational data. Also, there is some evidence, preliminary evidence that we have that migrant host country politics can influence political remittance cycles, but it's still quite early, and we're trying to give it some more thought before we present anything like that. So anyway, I think I'll leave it here for now. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions, comments, and suggestions.
So what's really interesting to me is that you can show this effect of the electoral cycle even though you cannot measure the money coming into elections, right? And I think it's one of the, if all boats rise in an election year. It's kind of interesting to me, right? And so I'm trying to think about the mechanism, which is one thing that I don't feel you've nailed down here. And so one element of this is you talk about political socialization, and so I sort of think about I'm thinking about the sources of political socialization, right? So when a high-income country, which is the sort of donor in your relationship, when conditions go up, right? What are the reasons why, you know, the low-income country where you came from would target your attention in the high-income country, right? And so there's another hopeless endogeneity issue in these comments, but there might be something there, right? It's simply the idea that maybe we go after all sources in an election year because an election year is a good reason to remind you of Mexico, right? Yeah. And so as a result, what is the connection between those sources of information in the high-income countries and the not just political ambitions, but the sort of extra political ambitions of a country, right? In that sense, the Mexican election represents an opportunity to get more of this money back home, right? So that's one way of thinking. One way that I was thinking about it. Another is that perhaps just the idea, and I think the way that you bring this up, the idea that people are engaged politically and they become more engaged, that it might be a little bit too micro level for the kind of mechanism that you're after here, right? I don't necessarily think it's the individual who is. I don't necessarily think it's the individual who is the doing the prime work here, right? Like your daughter and
yes,
television.
4 months old, she's sending extra money home. Yeah.
And so my question is, what contributes to the attention on television? And in that case, it's pretty clear you got a station from the U.S., but in other cases, it's not quite as clear.
Migrants are people; they have complex motivations, and remitting behavior is not sort of a simple thing. In terms of what we think is going on, I think it's fair to say that we know that given the data that we have, we can't demonstrate precisely where the money's going. To the extent that we can sort of have a better sense of the mechanism that's going on, we want to get at it by two things. One, if it's simply about more money is being sent back home because people are excited, then it shouldn't necessarily have this effect on election outcomes. So to a certain extent, we think that tells us something about what this money is doing. And the second thing is that the conditionality of these political remittance cycles tells us more as well. And this is one of the things this is the part that we're actually working on the most right now. And so to the extent that we can come up with measures of whether certain migrant communities have sort of active political organizations or not, to the extent that they do have their own newspapers. I mean, there are, for specific states in Mexico, there are newspapers that are targeted to people from that state in some migrant communities. So to the extent that we can get some of these things, and we actually, we're working on several things to try and get at direct measures of migrant political engagement. And so we think it varies a lot, and one of the things I didn't present is the data from the Philippines. And what we have there is from 1989 to 2011, we have monthly remittance data. And there are political remittance cycles, but not from overseas Filipino workers everywhere, just from some places. And we have some reasons we haven't fully developed all these results yet and the theory behind it, but we think it's crucial for trying to get at the mechanism of what's really going on here.
That's my concern right there. Is so the opposition party is going to target resources in terms of garnering the attention, and they're going to go to the countries where their supporters went, and they're going to. So they're in part in control of that kind of information.
I mean, on the Mexican case, there's a tendency to think that the panistas have worked much, much harder to get political support from Mexican migrants in the US, and so we might think that the political remittance cycles in sort of PNISTA-controlled territory should be greater, and in fact they are. I have more Mexico results that get at this as well. And so it's hard to present, I mean, this is a book manuscript, it's hard to present everything, but you know, when talking about the mechanism, we have to, one, admit a failing. We can't demonstrate where the money's going. But we can show the conditions that influence whether or not these political remittance cycles exist, and we can target that more narrowly to try and get at least some of these mechanisms.
Yeah, I think that, you know, when you do that, you can actually tell us what that relationship means. I think the problem with it now is it may all fall into the, your presentation doesn't quite do the project justice in the following sense, that you know, when you look at it, you think, well, it's just the countries to which the people migrated are just doing really well, so they're sending more back.
That's interesting.
And so it feels that way,
right?
Even though you find the other.
Recall that all these, I should mention it. You know, when we see high-income country growth doing well, remittances everywhere go up.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
This 25% increase is on top of that. That's comparing countries with elections under 4% growth versus countries without elections under 4% growth. So it's important to remember that these results already, you know, this is an interaction. These results control for that. And so, I mean, perhaps I did, you know, going through so quickly, I didn't emphasize that enough. It's not simply that all the votes rise. Oh, we know all the votes rise. Right. The votes rise even more when there's an election, compared to when there's not an election at the same level of growth.
And that provokes us, I think, to think pretty seriously about what that might mean and how that effect might be occurring, right? And that's the part that I was thinking.
Yeah, let me just follow up with one thing. There is a natural comparison of the sort of work we're doing to the work on electoral spending cycles in countries, right? And to the extent that, you know, governments try to make the economy appear better in the lead up to an election, and so there's, you know, the literature goes back decades, showing that under certain circumstances in some countries and for some elections, governments spend more to try and make things look good. What we're doing is comparable to what I would say a lot of what was done, and what's still being done in that literature early on, in that, you know, most of that literature doesn't say where's that money being spent. Right. It's just saying, look, spending went up.
That's right.
Okay? And so we're very comparable to that rather large literature. Now, what's neat about that literature is that you see stuff now where there's evidence of targeting specific programs, but it's taken that literature a really long time to get there,
right.
To be perfectly blunt. And we're, you know, as far as we know, we're the first to sort of look at sort of political determinants of remittance flows in this way. And so we'd like to get there eventually as well.
But I think they were slightly less reticent than you with the mechanism.
Oh, well, yeah, fair enough.
I share with Tony's concern. I mean, the ultimate question is how you use this sort of aggregate data to get into the underlying mechanisms. I was wondering, say, would there be other supplementary evidence? Say, for example, are there data showing that those who are receiving remittances from overseas, they tend to be more likely to vote for the opposition?
Yes.
So, I mean, if you have that kind of supplementary evidence, that would help to make your story more interesting.
I think, you know, in my desire to get all three parts of the story in a short talk, I sort of skimped on that. And yes, there's excellent evidence. So if you take a look at the Latino Barometer, and households or people who report that they receive remittances from overseas are roughly 5% more likely to say that they support opposition parties and candidates in elections. Similarly, surveys of migrants themselves typically report an even larger proportion are more likely to support opposition parties than those in their home countries. And so when we write this stuff up, we try to throw that in. You know, it's difficult to sort of integrate that into the analyses themselves, but the supplementary evidence is there. We think that the survey evidence that underline the mechanisms that we think are going on, the survey evidence, the ethnographic work, the case studies, we think it's there. What we think is that there's a tendency of people who look at the sort of evidence we're doing of analyzing international financial flows, they tend to ignore that sort of stuff. And so we wanted to show political effects in the sort of data that they're used to working on. right? Does that seem fair? Okay.
So I have two comments. One that I was recently reading Mexican New York, and I'm sure that's part of your sort of ethnographic background. And one of the things I was thinking about is I know there's a few people who are starting to do more research on hometown associations,
yes.
and have actually pretty good data on, because the Mexican government has been collecting data on
yes,
hometown associations. So I wonder if that could be supplementary data from the other direction so that you could get at the mechanism on that side. And then my other kind of question is actually sort of one of your theoretical underpinnings or premises is about that free and fair elections would attract more money in a way,
yes.
right? And so
yes.
I'm just wondering there's also the idea that if an election can be bought, right, that it would attract more money in that way. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes. Some of my other work that I've done is on political corruption more generally, so I'm happy to talk about both of those things. I like talking about buying elections. It's interesting and exciting, and it happens all around us. Anyway, first on the Mexico, and on, for example, hometown associations, that sort of thing, that is specifically one of the things that we're trying to do. So just to mention that the rough chapter structure of the book as it stands includes a specific chapter on subnational political remittance cycles in Mexico. You saw like three figures from it, but not, I showed you parts from, I guess, 6 different chapters, which is one of the reasons that perhaps it's a little disjointed. One of the neat things we can get, can, for our Mexico stuff, we're integrating, we can get data on hometown associations, we can get some data on newspaper availability. We can also get, we're trying to integrate data on where Mexican migrants from different states are in the US, combining that with data from Google Insights. I don't know if anyone even knows what Google Insights is. This is data on search trends, search engine data that goes back to 2003. And so one of the things that's interesting to note is that in these elections where we do see more PRCs in Mexico, there is, this is very preliminary, we haven't nailed this all down, there is more evidence of searching for information about that election in places like, there's a certain, I'm going to get which state it's wrong, but there's a certain Mexican community that's predominantly in Gardena, for example. And I don't remember, I think that's Michoacan, but it might be, anyway, but when it came to that election, we can actually show that Google, targeted Gardena, that Google searches and Google engagement with sort of things, the names of the candidates for governor and so forth. So we have far more specific data that we can do, say, for Mexico, to get at some of the organizational side, to get at the levels, varying levels of political engagement amongst Mexican communities abroad. And that's one of the things that we are really looking forward to do, and we've sort of, we haven't pulled it all together yet, but we know that there's good stuff there. And we have, I mentioned that we have one paper, it's part of a special issue on the politics of remittances that's under review at a journal, and two of the other papers are sort of targeted specifically things like hometown associations, and so we know the scholars who work on this, and so we've been in contact working with them. Yes, why should free and fair elections lead to more money? Now, if it is simply about buying political access and buying elections, they shouldn't, to be quite blunt. If we think that some of this money is either about enthusiasm about the election, yeah, competitive elections are more exciting. So if we think that that's the mechanism, yes, we should see remittances go up. If it's simply about buying political access, not clear. That should only matter. It should only go up if buying political access is more important in the lead up to an election. Okay, and so if it's a completely unfair, uncontested election, it's unclear to us that it's important to buy political access during that campaign, as opposed to any other day of the week, right? Finally, of course, if it is really an uncompetitive election, you don't get extra leverage from your political, from campaign donations and so forth, because it's already a foregone conclusion. So we do think that now there are uncompetitive elections that do generate some excitement and some interest, but we do think that for most migrants, for most people, it's the competitive elections that are more interesting and that provide greater leverage. So that's why we sort of really think that this is getting at sort of competitiveness is important, because we think it's not just about sort of buying elections. We think it's about sort of trying to influence elections, which is a different thing than buying an election, and trying to have greater leverage with remittances. Yeah?
I'm a recent migrant from India. Just some observations. I'm just wondering, what's the profile of the migrant that you're talking about here? Who has the capacity to send money to his home country, and the folks who are receiving that money will then spend money on political activities? I'm just wondering what that typical profile looks like. I mean, what is the socioeconomic level? And
I completely, that's a great question.
And then the flip side of it is, if I agree with you, yes, money is going in different cycles and at higher rates. I'm just wondering whether, so if we take a case of Mexico, where people from here might be sending money, but that people might be just a very, like the top 1%, you know, who might be saying, I want to influence the outcomes over there, instead of that broad base underneath the 99%, let's put it in that way, you know. The 99% have nothing to do with this, whereas the 1% might be sending the lump sum monies. That's the second, okay. Now I just want to go back to India for a second. And again, an observation, anecdote. I don't know whether Indians are sending money. You probably have the data. I have no clue on that, you know, for influence, you know, of this kind of in the political cycles. But I know this, that the inherent, you know, the feeling is in India that politicians are corrupt. Okay.
It's not just India.
No, I'm making a link here. Okay. Politicians are corrupt and they will buy their way through this election, number one. Number two, they buy their votes, buy people's vote by giving people money instead of getting money from people. So it's a very convoluted relationship. They end up giving blankets, whiskey, you know what. So I'm just thinking Indians, you know, at least me, and I can think of my cohort. I will, you know, somebody says, give us some money for politics. Like, are you crazy?
No, they should be giving us money. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I've spent 4 years, I do a lot of Japanese politics, and again, clientelism of this, electoral clientelism of this sort is not exactly uncommon. Okay, I'll start on that, okay, and then get to the other questions. Okay, so I absolutely think that politicians buy votes in most of the countries that we're finding these effects for. Where do the politicians get the money? Some of them are rich from they can get it from their own pocket. Some of them are not as rich and they get money from their own patrons within the party. And those patrons within the party may be rich themselves, but they're also part of a party organization that is raising money from, we'll get to that, this gets to your first and second question, from frequently other rich people, but not just rich people. So yes, I think absolutely that some of this, that we should be expecting some sense that some of this money is going to buy votes. Now, some of this money is also trying to buy independence from existing clientelistic relationships. Okay, so to the extent that I'm living somewhere and there's a traditional relationship with an existing politician, they provide me with certain monies and goods, particularly during the campaign, but more in general, they're supposed to look after me. If I have an independent source of from my brother or sister who lives abroad and sends money home, I'm not dependent on that patron as much as before. I'm in a different clientelistic relationship, but I'm not dependent on the incumbent patron as much. And so I do have, one of the things that we think is going on, and there is some, again, we have to go back to survey evidence and case studies, evidence that in fact, one of the reasons that people who live in families that receive migrants are more likely to support opposition, because they're not as beholden to the existing local clientelistic relationships. So I think absolutely that this buying votes happens, and what's going on is alternatives in some cases, or it can be funding that as well. We're seeing other vote buying, to be honest. Now, in terms of the sort of the profile of the migrant doing this, I think it's fair to say that the distribution of the survey evidence does suggest that a large portion of, say, Mexican migrants in the U.S. do send money home, and say that at least some of it is for political purposes. How much? Not clear. Typically, if we look at studies of political finance more broadly, the distribution of how much people give is very skewed. There are a reasonably large number of people who give relatively small amounts of money. Okay, and this is true in a lot of places, not just the U.S. or the developed world. And then there are fewer people who give lots of money. And I think this is true in migrant communities as well. And so I think we can come up with multiple profiles. That is, there are going to be a reasonable number of migrants, I don't think it's even 50%, maybe it's 20% or 30%, who send a little bit extra home, or a little bit of something to parties or candidates that they have some affinity to. And that's one thing. And then I think there is that 1% who have done exceptionally well and are big donors to the BJP, or you name your party. I don't know if you know, but the BJP gets an extraordinary amount of money from certain donors in London, for example, and the very rich. But this is what I'm saying. So, but the BJP also has a broader coalition of support in the expat community, and it's not just the very rich, right? And they also provide money. They also send money home through the BJP.
See, what I'm thinking is the average migrant worker here from Mexico is sending money that they're making for subsistence purposes back home.
That is, I completely agree. That is the bulk of money being sent home. I don't think no one in the right mind should disagree with that.
Okay, I think for the I think it's very fantastic to continue after this. Thank you, Ben, for
thank you so much, and thank you for the great questions.